Hi friends of Jubilee Plus. In this week's Monday Mercy, I want to talk about the myth of the undeserving poor. Those of you who followed Jubilee Plus for a while will remember perhaps that Martin Charlesworth, who founded Jubilee Plus, and I wrote our first book in 2014 called The Myth of the Undeserving Poor. And in that book, we looked at some of the ways our views around poverty and our kind of levels of compassion are set. Sometimes it can be based on our political preferences. Sometimes it can be based on the media that we consume on a regular or frequent basis, the headlines we're filling our minds with. Other times it might be formed by our own proximity to poverty, whether we've experienced it personally or whether we spend all week with people in poverty, or maybe we spend none of our time with people in poverty. Now, of course, Martin and I argue that for Christians, our views on poverty and our levels of compassion should be shaped entirely by the Bible, by what we read in the Bible. So often that's not the case though, because the society around us asks people, tell me why you deserve my help. Tell me whether you got yourself into this situation or whether it was circumstances beyond your control. We don't ask it that directly, necessarily, but these are some of the questions in our mind. I think for many of us, myself very much included, it comes more naturally to judge than it does to extend mercy and compassion. And so while Martin and I were preparing to write The Myth of the Undeserving Poor, I had the privilege of being in San Francisco for a few days, and I was walking around on my own in San Francisco praying, saying to God, I really need inspiration from you. I really need you to speak to me. I really need insight to help me write my half of this book. And as I was praying that, I kind of turned around a corner and there was a guy holding up a cardboard sign begging for money, saying, "Why lie? I want beer. Why lie? I want beer." And it was so stark, this prayer I'd been praying and then kind of walking almost into this guy, that I had to stop and ask him, do you mind if I ask about your sign? Do you mind if I ask about your story? And he started to share his life story with me, and he told me that he'd been a crack cocaine addict for most of his adult life. For years and years and years. And he said it had destroyed every relationship that he'd ever had. He said that it had basically wrecked his life and that he'd had multiple chances to get free of his addiction. But he said what had happened is every chance he'd had to get free, he'd taken it, but then he'd come out of rehab or what have you, and he'd gone straight back on drugs. He said, I've squandered every chance I've been given. And he explained to me that he had a 16-year-old son and he's never really been able to be in his life. And he took personal responsibility. He said, I've made bad choices. He was very open and honest about that. But he told me that he had actually kicked his crack cocaine habit with help, but he'd become an alcoholic. His words were, I've substituted one poison for another. It was fascinating listening to him, but he explained to me that obviously it's not ideal that he's still addicted to a different substance, but he explained the difference it had made is that as a crack addict, he couldn't be in his son's life at all. But as an alcoholic, he was allowed supervised visits, so he was gradually beginning to rebuild a relationship with his son. He explained that his health was better. His emotions, his mental health had improved, and it was making a massive difference to him. And it was part of his journey to becoming free of all addictions. It was a stepping stone. It wasn't the end destination. He wasn't happy to be there, but it was progress for him. And as he told me his story, he was saying that basically he was holding up his sign and he wanted to be honest about what he wanted to do with money he was given. He said, I'm here and I just need $3 to buy a beer and another magic marker because I've lost my pen that wrote this sign. And then he said, then I'll be able to get on with my way, get on with my day and go on my way. And as I heard his story, I thought, you know what, $3 is so little to me, but would mean so much to him. I so valued his honesty. And I think there's so much about when we hear people's stories. Of course, sometimes the people are going to say, I made bad choices. Haven't you? I've made loads of bad choices. And sometimes we live with the consequences of our choices for years. And sometimes God in his mercy sets us free from those consequences. But the value of hearing people's stories is that it allows space in our hearts to have compassion. It makes it less about does he deserve my help or not, but more about can I understand where you're coming from and where can I relate to you and what does that do in my own heart in terms of helping me be compassionate and gracious and kind. So take the time to hear people's stories. I know it makes such a difference in my life when I do that. It allows compassion to grow. It allows me to think about the other person rather than myself. So why don't we do that this week? Take any opportunity you get to hear other people's stories and let it move you to mercy.